Hi, everyone. Welcome to Poet. I'm Radha Marcum, and today I have the absolute pleasure of talking to poet Leslie Ullman, who is most recently the author of Little Soul and the Selves. Before I introduce you to Leslie, I'd like to invite you to become a subscriber of the Poet newsletter on Substack if you aren't already. Just go to poet2poet.substack.com and subscribe for free. In it, you'll find interviews like this one, plus helpful ideas on writing and publishing books of poetry. So again, today I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce you to Leslie Ullman. Leslie has published 6 poetry collections and a hybrid book of craft essays, poems, and writing exercises titled Library of Small Happiness, which I highly recommend. A 7th collection will be published by University of New Mexico Press next year, and her awards include the Yale Series of Younger Poets Award, the Iowa Poetry Prize, the New Mexico-Arizona Book Award, and 2 NEA fellowships. She is Professor Emerita at University of Texas, El Paso, and is a faculty member in the Low Residency MFA program at Vermont College of Fine Arts, and she lives in Taos, New Mexico. So welcome, Leslie, to Poet.
Thank you.
So, Leslie, we're going to talk about Little Soul and the Selves today, and I'd love to start with the book's themes, sort of the big questions behind the poems. So from the book's description, I pulled out a couple questions that were really interesting as a sort of background to the work. And those questions are, how does a spirit new to the world, baffled by the family domain and its customs, but above all curious, come to discover its essence? And what does any child carry into the present from ancestors whose histories have been assimilated and long forgotten? These are very, very powerful questions. So I'm curious for you as the writer, where did this inquiry start and how did it evolve into the book?
Yeah, it started. Well, first of all, I started it thinking I had nothing to lose. It was during the pandemic. I had been put on leave in one job and 2 jobs, actually. And I felt kind of sidelined. And I thought, maybe I'm going to disappear. So, maybe I should just do something that pleases me. And I was doing a poem a day project with 2 of my good friends. It was the first time we'd done it together for the month of August. And the first poem I wrote was gave me the character of Little Soul. Little Soul begins a series of field notes. And this character was like a side of me that as a child I never would have known, but as I've gotten older, I could make a character out of her. Is she really me? I won't go that far. But she was sort of an essential self, as opposed to the selves that we try on for most of our lives as we learn lessons, many of them the hard way, and begin to come to some kind of bigger sense of who we are and why we're here. And I didn't really have the answers to those questions, but she became, or it, I call it an it because it's not a female or a male, it's sort of a free, wild thing, which I think maybe we all have. And so I started out with this one Little Soul the first day of that August. And I thought, I'm just going to let this whole August be more field notes that Little Soul writes and see what Little Soul has to say. And at the same time, a good friend of mine was taking a course in ancestral memory from a wonderful rabbi, actually in near your neck of the woods, Tears of Firestone. And I think she's in Boulder. And she was teaching a course on ancestral memory, and it was very expensive. And I decided I didn't want to commit the money or the time, but I was fascinated by the notion that we may have memories that are lodged in us from generations ago. And my own family has carried none of that into the present. My family was so assimilated that Jewish history, any of our origins were just never thought about, much less discussed. We celebrated Christmas and Easter and all that. So I thought, and I was reading her book, Wounds into Wisdom, which was really powerful about ancestral memory and how it serves us. And I thought, well, I can't answer the questions she's asking in this book, but let me see if Little Soul can answer some. And let me see if my imagination will give me answers. So that was how it started. Then it branched out into other places. It didn't want to just be personal history, but it did start out with that and imagined personal history as well as actual. And then it branched out into me arguing about the nature of the soul with Louise Glick and T.S. Eliot especially. I found poems about the soul, a sort of synchronicity that I found these poems about the soul, sometimes in Poem a Day or whatever. And they were talking about the soul too. And I thought, well, I think I have something else to say about the soul. So then I thought, well, maybe this book is going to be about the soul. And then as I went on, I'm kind of giving you the whole trajectory of how this evolved. I think I'm conflating a couple of our questions. The next, so I revised those poems for a year. And then the next August, we did it again. And I thought, I need to have Little Soul talk about some different things. I can't just have Little Soul does this and Little Soul does that. So then I started having Little Soul just think about other things, or I fished out poems that I put aside years ago and realized that maybe Little Soul could have some influence on me revising them.
Hmm.
So I expanded the course of the book, and Little Soul started talking about things beyond personal history, which was good because I feared that this book, even though it was so much fun, I didn't want it to be completely mired in me or my imaginary version of me. I wanted it to not get lodged in any quagmire of personal history. And so that second August, I started to move things along. And with time, I saw that, I was having to deal with a trajectory of the development of a character, but I was also having to have the themes morph into new places. And that was a big challenge, but I took a lot of time with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think most of the poems came out in a couple of years, but the book actually took about 4 years to figure out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating to hear you talk about how the new work then was a lens on the old work, or sort of a way back into some of the territory that you maybe had been exploring prior to starting this work. And there is that sense in which new work can inform some kind of revision process.
Yes, I've had that happen before. It's just there's a new vibration to it when you put it next to some newer work, and suddenly it's in dialogue with that newer work, and it's new on its own. And that definitely happened. I stuck Little Soul in some of those titles, and I revised them a lot. But some of them, especially some older ones, in my days of being totally baffled by love and making a lot of mistakes, I let Little Soul talk about those mistakes. And I ended up with a series in the middle of the book, or a little past the middle, called Little Soul 6 Lessons on Love. And I let those mistakes and those poems that seemed so like, who cares about this? I let them be part of a trajectory of the soul making nature of love. And they stopped feeling trivial at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would you like to read maybe a brief history of weight to introduce folks
Yeah.
to this
Oh,
voice we're talking about?
yeah. And I'm glad you asked about that, because one thing I didn't realize till the book was almost finished was that not only was I finding myself writing about the nature of the soul, and it's kind of a philosophical realm there, but I also realized that weight and weightlessness were themes in the book, and I hadn't seen them until I came across this poem in a notebook, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's what I'm also writing about. So this became the first one in the book. In fact, it's before the table of contents, so it's kind of like a preface.
Mm-hmm.
A brief history of weight. Oh, wait a minute. I'm looking at the wrong, sorry, I put the marker in the wrong place. Let's try this again. A brief history of weight. Start with the stillness of streets before cars appeared, their cobblestones worn but not fragile. It's good to do this at dawn, midsummer, when light spreads like warm milk. Wait for the hush of your own thoughts to subside to a murmur that precedes the language you were taught. Let your feet relinquish the pavement, the soil beneath, the magma beneath that, and what else? The scarcely perceptible pressure of your footprints that fade so quickly over ancient ones, and the slower fade of a mountain or shoreline you won't notice anyway if you compare it to anything but itself. Clouds are another story. They disperse into vapor before they reform into denser versions of themselves to release water so plentiful you may begin to remember swimming through the streets, your legs withdrawing into nubs, then gills, back through fruited Eden to your life as a single cell, feeding at first off darkness. Now you open what isn't yet an eye and see nothing, your shape, all that has been created so far. You cast no shadow, leave no imprint, but you tremble with your future of replication, hint of what will later become a clothed, coiffed, accessorized, mortgaged, importunate body weighted with desires.
It's so striking to hear you read these poems, which to me, reading them on the page, they have this profound effect of grounding the reader in literal experience in the body, and yet feeling mythic in a way, symbolic, expressive, emotive. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that effect in this work, because it feels, there is this dialogue between the literal lived experience and that sense of creating a personal, mythos in a way.
Well, I don't think I think that evolved. I mean, I knew I was interested in Little Soul. So is this cat. Um, he's another soul. But I didn't quite realize until I was living with the poems and also trying to order them, which took forever. That was the hardest part of this, I think. The poems came pretty easily, but finding order was hard. And I think in that process, I began to understand that I had larger themes. And I also tapped into something that I think has always been in my mind in a lot of my poems, that I'm very aware of how momentary my lived experience is in relation to the history of all of life and the
Mm.
planet. Um, and rocks and things that are so much older than we are. And it's not that I'm saying, oh, we're so minuscule and oh, that's so wonderful and we're so trivial. It's nothing like that. It's just that I feel like I'm living on two planes at once, especially when I'm writing and and in rearranging these poems over and over. I realized that I had a huge canvas that I was playing with, and I wasn't using the whole canvas, but it was there. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. Yeah,
I
I think
haven't
so.
thought about that before.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a sort of widening of the lens, right? And as you said earlier, you didn't want to be stuck in a sort of personal storytelling. With the
Yeah.
poems, you wanted the poems to sort of be much more than that. And I think it has succeeded amazingly at bringing us into that experience of that widening lens.
I
Um,
think maybe our anxieties do that to us too. I bet you felt this as a writer yourself, that you have to reach beyond what feels like your limited view. And when you're afraid you haven't done that, something happens and you see a way to get beyond that, or you at least you try and you see a way to do it, and then it may or may not work. Um, but maybe that's just something we do because we want our poems to reach a little beyond where we thought they were going to go.
yeah. Yeah, I feel that with every poem. I'm just thinking, oh yes,
Yeah.
I was writing this morning, I had that feeling. And maybe I hadn't named it as that desire to go beyond, but I think I feel a sense of claustrophobia in a work before that
Yeah.
happens, if it hasn't happened already. And sometimes I will just abandon a poem or a project because I feel like it's not, it's staying too myopic in a way.
But I hope you come back to some of those later because they may jump
Well,
out at
maybe I
you.
need a soul in order to
No,
figure out
just
the
keep
way
them
back.
around. Don't throw them away.
Yeah,
Pay little visits to them now and then and see.
yeah, yeah. I love that. So we talked a little bit before we jumped on the video about the role of other people and community and supports that we might have in a process like the one that you're describing. For this book, what or who supported you most?
Well, the two poets I was doing poem a day with, and we've given one reading together and talked about this, Susan Eisenberg and Betsy Scholl. Both of them I know from Vermont College. And when you have to write a poem a day to to two trusted readers or eight trusted readers, I've tried that too. You have to just make something happen, whether or not you're in the mood, which we all three of us have found to be not always successful, but a lot of times astonishing in opening things up we didn't know were there. And then over the when it's not August, we have been sending poems for critiquing to each other once a week. So that's been one mainstay. But I have other friends I've been exchange. We look at each other's manuscripts and we help each other. And with some other friends, I would say, well, here's this manuscript. Do you think there's anything I should take out? Do you think in the beginning it was like which poems are strongest, which poems are a little weaker? But I had to be careful with that because I also had a trajectory and I'm not used to dealing with a plot. But I ran the manuscript by different people. And then, of course, working with Andrea, I chose Andrea. I did not shop this book around. I knew that, as you know, that Andrea Watson, the editor of Three Taos Press, is a very hands-on editor.
Mhm.
And I knew she liked the poems. And I thought, okay, before I get into too many weeds, I'm going to see if she wants this book because I'll bet she'll help me hammer out an order.
Mm.
And I was at a point where I really felt like I didn't know what to do and that I would figure it out eventually. But I thought Andrea might be a good catalyst. And I love the books that she publishes, they're just gorgeous. And so I worked with her. We worked with each other for a good year. And it was interesting because sometimes she said things she wanted me to take poems out I didn't want to take out. I thought, well, let me see if I can find a different place for it. And maybe she'll like it better. And so she would give me feedback. And then she had a lot of other work. So I didn't get back to her right away. So there were long periods of time between her feedback and me sending her a revision. And over time, I figured out how to keep most of the poems I wanted, but I also found a better order. And she was very helpful. She challenged me in ways that helped me, and she supported some of the decisions I was making that made me think, oh, okay, that's going to help a lot. Like putting those 6 poems on love, that really was a fulcrum in the book. That was so helpful. And I thought, okay, after these, I get to move to something else. And so we did that back and forth, and it was very helpful. I'm usually pretty good at ordering my own books, and I do it professionally for other people, but I was really stymied on this one. And I thought, let me just speed things up by getting help right now.
Well, when you have a good collaborator, a partner in that process who that you trust and whose editorial vision matches the vision that you have for the work. I
Yeah.
think it's very easy to say yes, let's do this. Uh, go through this process together. Um, and a lot of authors don't have that choice, right? They get assigned the editor that happens to be, for that press or for that prize, and you don't know what you're getting into, ahead of
Well,
time.
I would think if a book wins a prize, they're not going to just retool the whole thing. I
No,
don't know how that
probably
works.
not, but well, but it's not. I mean, my experience with with a, with a prize, and, with Andrea as well, both have been very rigorous in that process,
Mm.
and rigorous in different ways. And I trusted both of, actually, Andrea is also the editor I worked with at WordWorks. So Andrea and Andrea, my
Oh,
Andreas,
yeah.
um,
Well, that's
both had such wonderful, intelligent, questions about ordering, questions about certain choices in poems. And ultimately, I feel like both books are so much stronger for having been through that editorial process. And I don't regret any of the changes that were made in that process. So,
yeah,
um,
that's good. I do think, though, just for the sake of your audience, that another thing that I have found helpful with all my books and this one is that I have some friends whose work I really respect and love, and I have enjoyed reading their manuscripts and giving them some feedback, whether it's close feedback or just, I wonder if this poem belongs, or here's the themes I see you dealing with. And I have people like that in my life, as well as the editors I've worked with. And I give it to them and they give it to me, and it's so valuable. And they don't always agree, but that's okay, because it just gives me another lens to see through which to see the book. And I think it's really important to have those friends.
yeah, absolutely. Yes, yes. Friends, mentors, wherever you can get that trusted, uh, outside opinion, I think it's invaluable. That did make me think. I have had on occasion students ask me, well, if the editorial process is going to be so rigorous once this is accepted, why would I go through the trouble of, ordering and reordering and shuffling things around and perfecting the title and everything else? And I mean, I think this just really speaks to that misperception, right? That just because something is edited again, doesn't mean that we can slack off on that editorial process ahead of time. There's so many benefits that come of that process, even
Oh,
outside of
yeah.
creating a great manuscript. Like you said, it gives you a sense of what the work is, what work you've been doing, what has transpired, here and here, and in the work on the page.
Oh, I think when the writer has a pretty strong sense of what she wants her book to be, that adds authority to the manuscript. And it's the authority and the attractiveness of a manuscript that makes it win a prize or makes an editor accept it. So it's absolutely important that the writer have that huge connection and passion and enjoy the process of hammering that out. And I'll also say that not all editors edit that heavily.
Mhm.
I haven't had that kind of editing. This book is the one that I'm trying to think. Yeah, I haven't had too much heavy editing from any editor except this one. And I asked for it because I didn't think the book was ready when I gave it to Andrea. So it's so different. But yeah, you've got to attract those people in the first place. And also I think when the writer feels like, oh, I think I'm really speaking the truth now. I
Mhm.
think this is what I really want to say. This feels right. And it's a feeling that's so great that you almost say to yourself, if nobody takes it, I'm just glad I got to this point. I'm just grateful that I had this experience. But often, when you get to that kind of authenticity with yourself, that is what translates to a stranger.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, well said. Um, so one other aspect that of the process of working on this work, being a person of the world, being a teacher. You and I both have a love of the outdoors and being in the outdoors and doing outdoor activities, which I feel is, one of the sports that I turn to. It might have nothing to do with the work I'm doing, but somehow that experience of being outside does, come back into my work. So I'm just curious. I know you teach skiing, you ski, you teach skiing, you teach writing. How do those disciplines intersect for you? Does something transfer from one domain to the other?
Well, it's a little easier for me to compare teaching writing and skiing. I have a pretty good answer to that because I was amazed when I realized it. When I'm dealing with writers, I'm responding to their work on the page. I am reading them. And then my response to what I'm reading tells me, you know, what it is I think they're trying to do. And it gives me a platform from which to coach them. And I didn't realize till I became a ski instructor too, that I'm a coach. That's how I teach. I'm coaching because I'm watching what's in front of me. And then I'm responding to it and building on it. And I realized as a ski instructor, which was more terrifying than anything I've ever, well, it wasn't as terrifying as my first teaching, my first couple of years of teaching, but it was pretty scary. And I realized that I was watching their bodies and that my body was telling me what their bodies were probably feeling. And with that information, I was able to say, oh, you're a little scared when you start a turn, aren't you? Here's how you might feel better. Or you're a little tense when you finish a turn, as though you're afraid you can't do another one. Let's see if we can ease that so that you feel more ready to make another turn. So it's really, reading what's in front of you
Mm.
and using it to take people a little farther. And we, in our clinics, we were told the difference between teaching and coaching. And I had never been told that before. And I realized, oh, I'm a coach. That's what I've always been. As far as how it translates to creative work, it's a little harder for me to articulate that. But I think um, that the sports that I'm good at, and there are a lot I wasn't good at, team sports, anything where I had to hit something, forget it, and or compete with people. I didn't like competing,
Mhm.
but I love movement. I love grace. I
Mm.
love what it feels like to be in dialogue with in skiing with the landscape. I mean, I'm really working with it. I'm really talking to it. And it's talking to me. And I think that's how we work with language too. We're listening to language. We're listening to our own language. We're listening to where it's not working. We hear a better, more graceful way for it to go. So I think there's some relationship for me between the kinesthetic feeling of graceful athleticism with what I would like to do with language, which may be having to do with music, but it's all kind of a dance.
Mm.
And I'm being very abstract here, but I'm just not sure how else to describe it. It just feels right to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's
And
a sense of attunement, right?
yeah,
Attunement to uh, the grace of a turn, attunement to the nuance of language and what's happening there. And it
yeah,
does come back to a feeling in the body. And of course, plenty of poetry keeps us up here, but the best poetry is in the body. And I think we feel it before we know it. And the
yeah.
same
Well
could be said
said.
of of learning to ski or learning other disciplines. I mean, I think, there's probably a lot of wisdom that one might take from, learning to repair a car or
Yeah.
archery or whatever the discipline is. I'm a big fan of thinking about, well, how might that translate to what happens on the page?
I just realized, I don't know if this is going to sound okay or not, because I'm just coming up with it now, but it's almost like mastery is part of what constitutes mastery for me is knowing when I'm not doing it right.
Mm.
And then I can fix it. It's being able to recognize, oh, I just forced that turn. I'm acting like I'm afraid of the fall line. Well, let me see if I can work on that. Or this doesn't sound right. This rhythm is off. This line break feels clunky. I think I can make this phrase sound much better if I add white space. And so it's like hearing what's not working and knowing that there's a fix for it. And when I teach skiing, whenever somebody says, I give them a suggestion, and when they can feel the difference, I say, okay, I'm not going to say anything more to you now. I'm going to shut up. Now we practice because you don't need to hear any more verbiage. Now you just want to feel it.
Mm. Yeah. Right, right. It's that sense of trust that you can
Mhm.
um, cultivate in the student, right? Who's learning and practicing. And, I think it does take a long time for us as writers to have that sense of trust, if we ever have that sense of trust in the writing that we do, but to know when something isn't going well or not feeling right in whatever way that is. What a what a powerful place from which to do the work.
Well, yeah, and this is where revision comes in. There's no such thing as a bad, there's no such thing as a bad piece of writing. It's not working yet, but you have to start with something. And you should be grateful that you have the something. And I don't ever want writing students to ever feel ashamed of handing in something that needs some critiquing and some editing and some, cuts or development. I don't want people to ever feel link shame with that, because every draft is a step forward. And and that's so valuable to the process is all. I mean, that's it. That's the only thing we have control over, and we should never regret any aspect of it, even if when we look at it later we cringe. We shouldn't do that.
Yes. Well said. Um, would you mind reading? I thought maybe we could hear Little Soul on Thin Ice, A History of Navigation, since it ties in with this theme of um, disciplines.
To do that. This is a segmented poem. So it's like a few, one of the segments is only 3 lines. So I'll just try to pause a little bit between them, but it's like a little collage. Little Soul on Thin Ice, A History of Navigation. On the Forest Preserve's midwinter lake, I clung to my parents' hands. Every step I tried on the double runners turned my legs into strangers, mean things whose taunts I couldn't predict. Only my hands belonged to me, hanging on. The ice was an unfamiliar world, shocking as thunder, or the chlorinated water that once closed over my head and crushed me with silence. Watching my father shave before the mirror, his hands so sure and his skin a burnished tan over muscle, I thought his body was an unbroken law. Fevers never came to him like punishment. He could swim the length of the neighbor's pool underwater. He could fix lamps and cars and toilets, and once from a cigar box built a stage prop Geiger counter full of knobs and flashing lights. I never told anyone of the water that kept filling my mouth. I didn't know where it came from or what had broke it. I didn't know there was a word, saliva. My parents glided easily, laughing and upright, as though the ice were just another form of ground. How is it I've come to embrace the dance that is skiing, the tenuous bargain between gravity and trust, pushing the edge of too fast until I can bail out only by shifting my fear from foot to foot, one steering me out of the fall line while the other tries to steer clear of my brain flashing frozen tree, cracked bone, stained snow. Years I have pitched myself against the hardest trails, pitching myself in truth against the spinster child who lives in me still, with her chapped nose and skinny calves, hiding from the world with a book in her hand and an Afghan on her knees. How did I come to embrace the winter landscapes we've traveled all these years? The ice and exposed rock, the blinding powder, the drop-offs, tree wells, moguls. Sometimes we fly off a lip and become for a moment weightless, incandescent, our future thrillingly on hold. Looking down from the chairlift, we pluck at one another's sleeve and can't imagine hearth glow, can't imagine dry socks or sweet steam of cocoa. Can't imagine how I'm going to get us down this hill again.
I love that poem.
Thank you.
So many reasons, but
I can imagine you do.
but again, it feels like, of course, there are some I don't want to say obvious, but there are some tangible and lived embodied experiences that are described there, and yet it feels very at the same time evocative of even thinking about other processes like writing, that those last lines to me feel so much in the spirit of maybe Ars Poetica. And of course, you may not have thought of it that way, but there are all these resonances, I think, when you are being true to one experience. There are others that are, as you said earlier, sort of come along for the ride, or are these levels that you're inhabiting, multiple levels at once.
Well, I love that. I never thought of this as an Ars Poetica, but actually, thank you for saying that, because I think I can see that. I'm gonna own that one.
We can't help it, right? We're always writing.
Yeah, yeah.
um, but yeah, no,
That was a great
it's about
observation.
so much more than that. Um, so I'm curious. So you talked a little bit about organizing the book with the help of Andrea Watson at Three Tops Press. What was the organizing principle, and how did you decide to put the poems together once you had written them?
Well, I was really caught in the chronology of Little Soul from childhood. There's a lot of poems about childhood and family and adolescence. I mean, they're not about those things, but they take place during those periods. Um, and a lot of the early poems that I wrote, which seemed to need to be in the beginning of the manuscript, were from the point of view of a child who is baffled by this world. I once had a psychic tell me, "Oh, you have come into a lifetime that's totally new to your prior experience."
Mm.
Like I must have been a primitive until recently. And it has stuck with me for years. And I thought, well, I'm just going to let Little Soul um, acknowledge that. And I often did literally feel like a square peg in a round hole. I often felt that I could see things that other people couldn't see. And that when I brought them up, they told me, no, that's not true. And I wasn't raised by mean people. I was raised by good people. But I did feel like a stranger a lot of the time, and I didn't know it. But
Mm.
when I thought about what that psychic said to me years ago, I thought, well, I'm going to just go ahead. I'm going to run with that one. So there are a lot of poems in the beginning about the strangeness that this being, the selves, feel. Um, and I realized that as the book went along, Little Soul and the selves were going to become more fused. That in the
Mm.
beginning they were separate, and the selves were the ones who were flailing around, and Little Soul didn't quite know what to do about it all. And gradually that shifted. Um, but then I had poems that were not about all that, and I thought, how am I going to feed these in? And I tried alternating, and that didn't work. And then I tried going with some chronology and then breaking off and then picking it up later, and that seemed to help. But I just had to um, I so I had to find a balance between not only a chronology of a life, but a development of thought process and of perspective beyond the personal into looking at the world. So I had those two things I had to manage. Um, and then I also had some other poems that sort of went with those, but didn't completely. And I think finally, when you put a book together, you want to find poems that flow one to the other without jolting the reader, which is something I've always felt comfortable doing with myself and with other people. But having a chronology and a development of a sensibility kind of messed me up for a while. And so I had to keep that, but I also had to find that flow where I could throw in a kind of a wild card here and there and have it not break things up, have it not jolt the reader, which isn't to say that it won't, but I did what I could. And that just took a long time. And as I said earlier, some of the things that helped me the most were when Andrea thought I should take a poem out. At
Mm.
one point, she wanted me to take 6 or 8 of them out. And I thought, I really don't want to do that. Let me see if I can find a way to integrate them in the flow so that they feel like they belong. And even though I was dismayed by the suggestion, it really prompted me, I think, to make some of the best decisions I made for this book. But I did it out of discomfort.
Mm. Hmm.
So
Yeah. Yeah, such a dynamic process, right? When you're trying to think about that, the arcs that you're describing, plus the individual poems and how they're talking to one another, how they flow together. But you know,
Yeah,
maybe you don't want it to get too much of the same thing, right? Otherwise,
yeah.
the reader can kind of fall asleep in the midst of all that. So it's such
Or
a
I can fall asleep.
dance. Yeah, it's such
Yeah,
a
so
dance.
it was rigorous and it was very helpful. Looking back, I think Little Soul must have been the one that said, just show the book to Andrea. Don't spend $400 on entry fees. Just go show it to Andrea and let her help you. And I think that was very wise of some part of me,
Hmm.
because
Yes.
my usual way is to go ahead and campaign a book for a little while.
So talk to me a little bit about that, because I think this is a position that so many of us find ourselves in, whether we've published a book or not. Should we go for all the contests, or should we, take some other route to publication? And you've done all of it. So what advice do you have around that? And what was that self saying to you? Why did you listen to the voice that was saying, let's take this manuscript to Andrea?
Well, I was starting to listen to a similar voice the last, the book before this one, um, and the one that's coming out from UNM. I mean, I won two big contests early in my career, and I thought, oh, contests, yeah, that's a great way to go.
Mm.
And that stopped happening a long time ago. I stopped winning contests. And often most of the time not even getting listed in the finals. So I thought, okay, um, new age, this is a new time. The times are changing and changing and changing in layers. And I've been at this a long time. So I thought, okay, let me see if I can figure out where my tribe is.
Mm.
And I wasn't quite that articulate about it, but looking back, I think I was trying to figure out what which publishers might be interested in what I write. And in one case, well, when I long ago, well, oh gosh, where do I start? I did finally, with these last two books, go back to two presses that had published me before.
Mm.
And I had never done that. I had had different presses for every single book I wrote. And I thought this time, why am I doing this? What am I trying to prove? I'm an older person. I am not from a diverse community. I don't represent the underrepresented voices that are now getting attention and deserve to get it. So let's just stop trying to throw my work into that arena, and let me just see who, what presses are, well, two things: what presses are publishing people that I feel some kinship with,
Mhm.
and then also, um, I decided with these books, here's two presses that already know my work. UNM, I didn't have any guarantee that they would take another book, but I felt perfectly comfortable about trying them again. And
Mhm.
actually, that book was accepted way before this one. I think it was accepted I barely started the one that just came out. So I thought with UNM, they know, I know them, they know me. They don't have to take the book, but I do live in New Mexico. They're my university press. Why am I shunning? Why am I figuring I shouldn't try them again? I would love to have another book out from them. So I've started going back to familiar territory, and I'm starting to look at presses where friends are publishing and seeing who else they publish, to see, well, maybe if I start searching around again. Um, so I'm looking for my tribe, which is a whole lot different from entering contests.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. I love the way you put that. Yeah. A press is a tribe. It is a collection of voices
Yeah.
that ideally are in conversation with one another in some way, even if they're very different voices.
Yeah, and there may be a little bit of a generation thing going on here. There are a lot of poets in my generation that are still doing wonderful work, but there's so many new poets after that, and those other generations include editors and judges. So, my generation still has a place, not as big a one as it did, but I don't mind being in that place with them.
Yeah. Well, and Andrea's work at Three Taus, I mean, she really has published such a variety of voices, but there is a real sense of, I think when you said that a manuscript comes into its own authority, that's something I feel in the work that she tends to select, that there's a real purpose for each book. Whether that book is, Little Soul and the Selves or about the conquistadors,
Yeah.
Jeremy's book, or Madeline Garner's beautiful work on the AIDS crisis. So those are very different subject matters, different voices, but there is that sense of a real authority and purpose behind each work.
And she accepts books that already have a strong thematic thrust, but then she works very closely with them and gets them to be even tighter. And I almost felt with mine, I don't want it too tight
Mm,
because it's going to just implode. It has to have some bubbles in it. It's got to have something, so that it can keep that tegument that holds it together, but
mm,
not be too tight. And that was the challenge. And that was where our work together was really helpful.
yeah, yeah, wonderful. So I wonder if you might read one more poem to close us out. Little Soul contemplates skin as the largest organ of the body.
Yes, I that was one of the ones. Oh, where is it now? Here we go. That was one of the ones that I found in a folder from years ago. And I realized it was speaking to so many of the poems some of the new poems I'd already written. So, and those poems, I just gave them to Little Soul. They're Little Soul's poems. Smooth wings singing on air. In bed at night, I would start the story. Once there was a little girl, but couldn't think what came next. I wanted to be heard by everyone in my life exactly as I sounded to myself. Wing, singing. But the words kept imploding like the fragile soap bubbles I tried to blow gently to the top of our elm. So I'd pretend I was Davy Crockett, wounded in the shoulder, finally resting, certain the Alamo would hold and my faithful horse would soon carry me home. I must have wanted to wrap myself in something that would bend but not break as I moved through the day's white water, the reprimands and questions, large people coming in and out of any room to bump against my thoughts. The way I imagined a cloud would hold if I landed from a great height, a little giving ground, a little firm sky. I must have been seen as a sulky kid, a walking scab, and just wanted to get by. From the valley that cradles me now, I straighten up and peer over the rim like the sun. I touch my shoulder. It's nearly healed. And the heart? A sapling, a flowering, an old tree full of nests. For the child who couldn't find an ending but learned to build poems out of twigs, I breathe a thanks long in coming. And for the mountain that keeps its shape beneath swaths of fog. And for the friends who have breathed their stories over mine, flowing in and out of the homes I have lived in, the walls inhaling and exhaling to hold us. And for the tall horse that has carried me along dunes and ditch banks, giving me something like wings, though he is sometimes afraid of shapes in the wind.
Mm. I just love that poem so much.
Thank
Um,
you.
because it has that like you were describing and building the whole book, it has a sense of that arc, the arc of time, the arc of a lived life, the arc of um, the making of a soul, the making of a poet. Um, right, the veil of soul making, it's all in there. And I think it's just a beautiful way to it's not quite the end of the book, but it's close to, right? It's a good ways in and feels like
Yeah.
it's sort
Yeah.
of bringing us into that sense of, it's not exactly resolution. Um, but there is a sense of maybe that widening that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I think maybe we have an instinct um, to put our experience into stories that make sense to us, and that can be very healing. And we may be making something up, but we are also trying to tell the emotional truth, even if we're not telling literal truth. And that's a real impulse, maybe behind so much of our writing. And I'm not always doing that in all my poems, but I think this book was really an attempt to do that over and over again.
Well, it's a beautiful permission to all of us who want to live in this way, and write and um, feel feel accompanied on that journey. So yeah, it's just the whole book is gorgeous, and I hope everyone who's listening will go out and get a copy. So on that note, Leslie, where can people find the book, and where can they learn more about you if they'd like to?
Well, I think the best way to get the book is directly from Three Taos Press. I think if you Google it and just go to the author page, it's a pretty easy website to deal with. And the book is shipped for free. It's kind of heavy. Her books are, because the paper is so amazing.
Yes,
Um,
it's
so
yeah,
that's the best way to get it. And she loves to get, yeah, and the cover is thick. Um, so I think Amazon is a possibility. They often run out, but Andrea doesn't. So that's the best place to do that. And I have a website which needs a little updating, which it will get pretty soon, especially given the gift you just gave me with this interview. And by the way, I love your term. What did you say? Permission? You used an adjective. Oh, it slipped my mind. That's what I would want this book to give people for their own writing. Permission. But anyway, my website is leslieallman.com, lowercase, both names put together. And it's easy to get to. And so that's probably a good place to go.
great. Well, Leslie, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time to introduce us to this beautiful new book.
Thank you very much.